So as I was saying on the last video, there's a lot of talk about you installing Linux and having it on there as a Linux daily driver. And I started to wonder, what does that really mean? And yes, to reduce rambling to an absolute minimum, I'm going to put a lot of jump cuts throughout this video. So I'm kind of a veteran and a Linux noob. I have used Linux ever since like Red Hat was first a thing, since it came out on CDs and you had to get them off magazine covers half the time. I've been using it a very long time off and on. I went from like Red Hat to Mandrake and even Fedora later, but Mandrake was probably, I did have Mandrake on for quite a while as my main machine. That's all I used. I mean, I did have all the various Windows over the years. I had OS2 for a while as a main machine, but I did have Linux for a while, and then I did have XP as well for a bit. I didn't have Vista, but then after that I've used most of the Windows distros over the years, and it really doesn't worry me. I'll use anything. I do use most of the same software. I'll use GIMP and things like that even if I'm using Windows, so I'm still using a lot of the same software. And I did use OpenOffice for a long time. I did have a lot of trouble with file formats. When we moved, I was sick for a while too. I had aortic dissection, so I wasn't well for a while. So I just used whatever. Yeah, I got a little tiny Windows box, and I was just using that, mostly just browsing and doing basic things. I didn't need anything fancy. It wasn't until recently I started to get back into editing things and wanting to use GIMP again, and eventually I got a spare PC where I can install things. I did try Ubuntu off and on for a while, and I just never really hit it with Ubuntu. It was only recently I went back and started using Fedora KDE again. That's just familiar territory, and I quite like it. But so I'm sort of new as well, because I sort of get back in and then I go out of it again. And things have changed a lot. So many things are different, as I've said in the last video. So it's always new and interesting to find all these things out again. So I saw a YouTube reactor, and he was talking about the Linus Tech Tips videos and their concept of a Linux daily driver and how they were concentrating on gaming and such. And I certainly I am in the process of trying a few distros and seeing what does work, because Linus Tech Tips, they sort of concentrate on two distros. I think they use Manjaro and Linux Mint, I think. He was going to use Pop OS. And that would have actually been worse, really, because they're sort of both Ubuntu and very similar distros in a lot of ways. So it was actually good he went with Manjaro. So they gave a little bit of difference. Gave us sort of Arch versus an Ubuntu base. So that was actually pretty good. So that was a bit of a luck there. So but I'm going to try a few different distros with just with Steam and a few other games and the things that a normal person might want to put on a PC. But it did make me think of what a daily driver does involve. So I wasn't planning on using this PC as a daily driver, but I did put it together from spare parts, and I had it laying around. I thought, well, it would be a good PC to put together to test some of the gaming, putting Steam on various distros and that sort of thing. So, but because I was using it for that sort of thing all the time, I end up, because I'm a relatively lazy person, once I set that up, I just started using it as a daily driver anyway, because I don't have a lot of needs for a computer anyway most of the time. As long as I can run a browser and a few other things, that's fine for me. So I end up using it most of the time anyway, so it sort of has become a daily driver for me. Hardware wise, it's an AMD 2600X on a B350 board, so it's fairly old hardware. A lot of the hardware is an original PC I built back in 2017, and then the computer, this in the main box here, and I've since swapped a lot of those components out and they've been laying around. So I put the 2600 on the B350 board. It's got about 16 gig of RAM, 500 gig SSD. It's got like an old 570 video card, which was a super cheapie when I got it, but it runs some cheap Logitech peripherals. I mean, I think I paid $20 for the keyboard, so it's not expensive. I did put the just put the Snowball mic on there, which worked fine. I'm using just analog speakers on it. When I first installed Fedora, it did not work with the HDMI sound on the monitor. Manjaro did, which was interesting. I did later find that there was a quick setting to get Fedora working, but at the time it wasn't, so I just whacked on the speakers, which worked fine. So like I say, simple hardware certainly helps with Linux if you've not got anything too complicated. And as I say, I put Fedora KDE on. I went for Fedora because I'm more familiar with Red Hat and KDE just historically. I use KDE since it first appeared, really, and I used Red Hat very early, so I was familiar with RPM. I did try Manjaro, which I really liked. I did use Manjaro KDE for that familiarity again. I really did like the way Manjaro installed. I loved the package management system and the command line especially. I did really like the idea of the rolling distro, which I thought was a really good idea, and I thought that could be very nice in the long run. And so I was planning on keeping that as a main distro. However, I was changing back and forth, trying various distros at the time for this other test I'm doing. And I also was playing around with the updates and rolling distro, and I managed to kill a couple of my bits of software I was using for production, and I decided I would just go back to that comfort zone of Fedora KDE, mostly just for the production side of it. So I decided I'll keep that on a partition as a production, so because it then became this daily driving PC, which was interesting, and I kept that partition for daily driving, and then I was testing on another drive. I actually pulled this cheap Western Digital Green out of another machine and started using it for doing the test petition. So for installs of Linux. So, but otherwise, I did like Manjaro. I may even go back to that again in the future when I get all this sorted out. Fedora also, as far as I know, is mostly an open source distribution by default. You can open up RPM Fusion, free and non-free, and you can add Flatpaks and stuff like that. So it gives you options. That gives you options for either staying open source or using the proprietary software, because it does matter to a lot of people. It doesn't matter to me so much. I'm quite happy to use both and annoy people that way, but some people like to be purists, so it gives you more opportunity to be a purist. I think Manjaro does seem to, by default, have some proprietary software. At least it did have Steam already installed, so does make it easier though for a lot of things for a new user. As for software, I did make a list. Mostly I'm using these days I'm using a browser. I mean, these days if you've got a browser, you can do so much just with the cloud. You can even do pretty much everything cloud these days. I know that's not what everyone wants to do, but if you've got a machine that can run a browser, you can do quite a lot online with mail, word processing, and all of these things. So, and anything's going to run a browser. So, mostly I'm using browser, word processor, VLC, but then I use VLC as another one I use on Windows as well. Of course, a video editor, Discord. I am using OBS a bit at the moment as well, just mostly for this work. I don't use a lot. I use it for capturing video games if I'm doing those streams. Sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. And at the moment also with this test I'm using VirtualBox quite a bit. BitTorrent for downloading all those terrible ISOs. I also put some games on there, mostly Minecraft, because I do run Minecraft, and I run a Minecraft server for the extended family, so it's over in the corner. It's like a little Dell business box, an old Haswell thing, which is enough for the few people that are on it. I do run Steam on there as well, mostly for testing this stage, but it will run quite a few games, and that's part of what I'm going to do in the next video. Frozen Bubble, of course, because you've got to have Frozen Bubble, and you really need Linux or Android or some sort of Linux distro to run that. I don't know if it comes on Windows, and that's tragic, really. So I'm doing mostly web work with some word processing. I'm using LibreOffice over here, not to mention the fact that you can just use Microsoft Office Online anyway. So like I say, I've got the VirtualBox on there for some of the installs, and I've got the video editor. I did some OBS work on there to capture some of it because that's a nice easy way. GIMP is another one I use. I use that on Windows as well, so that's a very handy one. It's great for doing your thumbnails and various other things. So most of the ordinary everyday software is not a big deal for me, and this is where I think everyone's daily driver use is going to be different. For me, it's not a big issue. I don't need a lot of software. So when I'm looking at various distros and how they're going to go, I don't think any of these everyday apps are a problem, because they're going to go on, they're pretty much available straight off the bat on a default install on pretty much any distro. They're not going to be the problems. It's going to be games. I'm going to be looking at installing quite a few games, installing Wine and Steam and Minecraft, because I use Minecraft, maybe Lutris and some of these sorts of things on various distros. Also looking at how many of these things are available as a default, and how many you're going to have to change repositories, or how many you're going to have to resort to the command line in various distros, because I have a feeling that most of these things are going to install, whether it's Steam or games or any of these things, are going to install on any distro. I don't see that there's any distribution that's going to not work with any of these things. I think it's just a matter of how easy it's going to be. So as an update edit, what I'm suggesting is that anything I can install on Fedora or Ubuntu is going to install equally well or badly on any other distro. Even if it's a library dependency, chances are that'll get sorted out anyway. I mean, in my case, I could game and stream the Windows machine, but that's not exactly the point. I'm actually trying to run them on the machine, pretend this is my only machine, and just run things as if it is a single machine rather than try and stream. So in the end, I've been using this machine exclusively as a daily driver for a couple of weeks, and it really doesn't matter. I mean, before that I was exclusively, well, most of this year I've been exclusively using a Windows machine. These days with the distros, they seem very easy, but I am going to try a few and just see which ones are most obvious. At the very least, I'm going to try Pop and Linux Mint, Debian, Ubuntu. I wasn't going to try Ubuntu, but I'm going to throw Ubuntu in there. Fedora for the RPM distros, Manjaro, and maybe EndeavourOS, and maybe even Arch, but at least a couple of the, probably not Arch. Arch probably a little bit harder though, for normal people coming across, but at least Endeavour and Manjaro. Probably more Debian than anything else, because there just are more Debian based distros. RPM, it'll probably just be Fedora, because there are some Mandrake derivatives still around, but really I don't see much point to go beyond Fedora. So yeah, it'll be a couple of Arch, a few Debian maybe, and mostly just the popular ones that people are going to use. I think I will throw Ubuntu in there for a look. So it'd be interesting to see that. I haven't installed Ubuntu for a while. It's been a year or so. So I'll try the new 2110, I think it is, and see what it's like. So in the end, it's taking a bit longer than expected. So I think I'll stick a drive back in again. Because I have got a couple that I've just put on to virtual machines that weren't working real well there. It could be just the virtual machine, so I'm going to stick them on a drive to double check and see how they go. And then hopefully have that video out pretty soon.